The city had just awakened, its skyline glowing in the first light of dawn. The towering glass building of Harrington Global Solutions reflected the golden hues of the morning sun, standing tall and proud against the horizon. It was a company known for its precision, its cutting-edge systems, and its relentless pursuit of perfection. Inside that building, men and women in sharp suits moved briskly, every step synchronized with a rhythm of ambition. Yet on this particular morning, beneath the calm surface of order and confidence, chaos was brewing. In the executive boardroom on the 45th floor, the air was tense. The CEO, Richard Harrington, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and a reputation carved in decades of corporate leadership, sat at the head of the long mahogany table. His usually calm, commanding presence seemed shaken. His eyes darted to the large screen on the wall where endless lines of red error messages flashed. The company's central operating system, its lifeline, had crashed. This was not a minor glitch. This was a full-scale collapse. Harrington Global Solutions powered financial transactions, government contracts, healthcare logistics, and even critical infrastructure. To see it all go dark in a single moment was not just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. The executives seated around the table whispered nervously, their words laced with fear. Millions of dollars were vanishing by the second. Clients were panicking. Contracts were at risk. And Richard Harrington, for the first time in decades, felt utterly powerless. "This can't be happening," he muttered under his breath, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed his temples. "Not today, not now." The head of IT, a man named Thompson, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, we've tried every protocol. We've run the backups, checked the firewalls, and even pulled in external consultants. Nothing is working. The system isn't just malfunctioning, it's locked. Someone, or something, has overridden our controls." A heavy silence fell over the room. Executives exchanged looks of dread. For years, Harrington Global had boasted of being unbreachable, invincible in its digital fortress. And yet, here they were, stripped bare in front of the world. Richard's thoughts spiraled. His company was built on reputation, and reputation was everything. One failure, one collapse like this could erase decades of work. He thought of the press waiting outside, of shareholders demanding answers, of government officials knocking on his door. And beneath all that, he thought of his father's voice echoing from his childhood. "Never let them see you weak, Richard. Never." But weakness was written across his face now. His breathing grew shallow, his heart pounded against his chest, and for the first time in his long career, Richard Harrington whispered the words he had never imagined. Maybe this is the end." While chaos ruled in the boardroom, a very different world existed just a few floors below. In the service wing of the skyscraper, where polished shoes rarely walked, Maria Johnson worked quietly, wiping down the marble floors. Maria was a black maid in her late 40s with kind eyes that carried both exhaustion and resilience. For years she had cleaned this building, moving invisibly through its hallways. To most of the executives, she was just another face in the background, someone who made sure their offices gleamed when they arrived each morning. But Maria's life was more than dusting tables and polishing brass. She carried on her shoulders the weight of raising her son, Daniel. He was 19, tall and thin, with a mind as sharp as the city lights at night. Since he was a child, Daniel had loved computers. While other kids played outside, he would sit in the corner with an old laptop, teaching himself coding, breaking apart programs just to rebuild them. Maria used to watch him with wonder, often asking, "Danny, how do you make sense of all those numbers?" He would laugh and say, "Mom, numbers talk to me. They're like music. I just listen." Maria was proud of her son, though she worried too. Opportunities didn't come easy for kids like Daniel. Despite his talent, doors often closed before he could even knock. Maria had seen it too many times. The subtle glances, the dismissive tones, the invisible barriers that seemed to rise whenever her son tried to step forward. Still, she told him to keep going, to never let the world dim his brilliance. That morning, Daniel had walked his mother to work. His own day was free. He wasn't in school, but he carried with him his ever-present laptop. Maria smiled at him as they parted ways in the lobby. "Stay out of trouble. Danny," she said, kissing his forehead. "Trouble finds me, Mom." he joked, but his eyes were already darting to the screen in his hands, where lines of code danced like fireflies. As Maria polished the lobby floor, she noticed the unusual rush in the building. Executives moved quickly, their eyes wild with panic, their phones glued to their ears. She paused, curious, and overheard fragments of conversation, words like system failure, millions lost, and unrecoverable. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she felt the fear. Meanwhile, Daniel sat quietly in the corner of the lobby, headphones on, his laptop open. He wasn't trying to intrude, but the building's network was practically screaming for help. Signals of distress echoed through the digital airwaves, broken pathways flashing like sparks. Daniel's instincts kicked in. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, itching to respond. Back upstairs, Richard Harrington sank into his chair. His executives bombarded him with questions, but his mind drifted. He thought of his empire crumbling, of the headlines that would declare his downfall. And in that moment of despair, he said aloud, "I've lost all hope." Unbeknownst to him, hope was sitting just a few floors below, in the form of a young black man with untapped brilliance. Daniel was about to step into a world that had never made room for him. And in doing so, he would not only shock the CEO and his empire, but rewrite the very meaning of power, dignity, and justice. The stage was set. The collapse of a system had broken a man who believed himself unbreakable. And the solution, unexpected, unrecognized, and uninvited, was about to rise from the shadows of the janitor's wing. The elevators chimed one after another, their polished steel doors opening and closing in a frantic rhythm. Executives dashed in and out, their voices sharp with urgency. The building, usually a monument to efficiency, now felt like a ship taking on water, panic leaking into every corridor. On the 45th floor, Richard Harrington sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the streams of code flashing across the big screen. The IT team scrambled around him, plugging in drives, resetting servers, and muttering to themselves like surgeons losing a patient on the operating table. Nothing worked. The head of IT, Thompson, wiped sweat from his brow and whispered, "Sir, we've exhausted every option. This doesn't look like an external hack. It's as if the system itself turned against us." Richard clenched his fists. He had built his empire on control, on the belief that every problem had a solution if you threw enough money or manpower at it. But here he was, staring at the lifeblood of his company, gone, corrupted, mocking him with every flashing error message. Downstairs, Maria Johnson continued her work. She could hear the echoes of the chaos above. She didn't understand systems and codes, but she knew the sound of fear, and that was what she was hearing now. As she wiped down the counter near the lobby entrance, she glanced at her son Daniel, who sat in his usual corner with his laptop open. His brows furrowed, his fingers hovered over the keyboard like a pianist waiting for the orchestra to begin. Maria walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Danny, what are you doing?" Daniel pushed his headphones back. "Mom, their system is collapsing. I can see it. It's like someone flipped all the wrong switches at once. They are drowning up there." Maria frowned. "And how do you know this?" Daniel gave a small smile. "Because their network is screaming. It's like walking past a burning house. You don't need to go inside to know it's on fire." She shook her head, both proud and worried. "Don't get yourself into trouble." But Daniel couldn't help himself. The broken pathways on his screen felt like a challenge, like a puzzle calling his name. His fingers began to move, tapping rhythmically as lines of code formed and vanished. He wasn't inside their system. Not yet, but he was close enough to see the outlines, the weak points, and the tiny doors no one else had noticed. Upstairs, the boardroom had grown quieter, heavy with despair. Some executives whispered about calling the competitors for help. Others murmured about legal consequences, shareholder lawsuits, and federal investigations. Richard heard every word, and each one pierced him like a blade. His father's words haunted him again, "Never let them see you weak." And yet here he was, a leader exposed before his people. Suddenly, Thompson's screen flickered. For a brief second, the lines of error messages paused, then resumed. "What was that?" he muttered. Another technician leaned closer. It looked like interference, like someone's trying to reroute. "From where?" Richard barked. The technician squinted at the stream of data. It's coming from inside the building. All eyes turned to him. Inside the building? Richard repeated. The technician nodded. Yes, it's not an attack. It's like someone is trying to fix it. The words hung in the air, heavy with confusion. No one in that room could imagine who, inside their fortress of wealth and power, would have the audacity or the skill to touch their systems uninvited. Meanwhile, Maria stood nervously in the lobby, glancing between her son's glowing screen and the elevators that shuttled frantic men and women up and down. Daniel's hands flew across the keyboard, his eyes lit with intensity. He was no longer just a boy in a corner. He was a conductor commanding an orchestra only he could hear. "Danny," Maria whispered, fear threading her voice. "What are you doing to them?" "I'm not hurting them," he said softly, never lifting his eyes. "I'm trying to save them." Maria's heart clenched. She had always told him he was destined for something great, but she had never imagined it would look like this. Her son, a young black man who had been turned away from so many opportunities, now secretly holding the power to rescue one of the largest companies in the city. Upstairs, Thompson's screen flickered again. This time, the pause and error messages lasted longer. A green line of code appeared, cutting through the chaos like sunlight through storm clouds. The technicians gasped. "Someone stabilizing the servers." Thompson exclaimed. Richard leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Who?" "We don't know," the technician admitted. "But they're good. Whoever it is, they're rewriting the code faster than the system can collapse." Richard's mind spun. Years of commanding power had taught him to question everything, to suspect everyone. But now, as he watched the system breathe again, he felt something foreign. Dependence. Someone, somewhere, was holding his empire together, and he had no idea who it was. Downstairs, Daniel's fingers moved like lightning. He found the corrupted files, traced the loops of sabotage, and began to rebuild from the inside. To him, it wasn't just code, it was art. He could see the patterns others missed, the hidden rhythm beneath the noise. Every keystroke was a brushstroke, every line of code a note in a symphony only he could play. Maria watched him, her heart swelling with pride and fear. She knew what it meant to be overlooked, to be invisible in a world that measured worth in titles and suits. And now her son, a boy they would never have invited into their boardrooms, was holding their future in his hands. Minutes passed. Upstairs, green lines spread across the screen. Servers that had been lifeless roared back online. Databases unlocked. Transactions resumed. A cheer erupted in the boardroom, executives clapping each other on the back, relief flooding the air. Richard, however, sat still. His eyes narrowed. "Find out who's doing this," he ordered quietly. The technician typed furiously, tracing the signal, peeling back the layers of digital disguise. Finally, he froze. His eyes widened. "Sir, it's coming from the lobby." "The lobby?" Richard snapped. "Who in the lobby has access to our system?" The technician swallowed. "Not staff, not executives. It's a kid. A young man. I don't know how, but he's fixing everything." The boardroom fell into stunned silence. Richard's mind raced. Who was this boy? How had he gained access? And why, in the middle of his empire's darkest hour, was a stranger in the lobby carrying them to salvation? Downstairs, Daniel leaned back, sweat on his brow but a triumphant spark in his eyes. "It's done," he whispered. "The system is stable." Maria squeezed his shoulder, tears brimming in her eyes. "Danny, what have you just done?" Her son smiled faintly. "I gave them back their hope." What Daniel didn't know was that his quiet act of brilliance was about to shatter walls far stronger than firewalls. In a world that never expected him, that never welcomed him, he had just proven himself indispensable. And when the CEO came looking for the face behind the miracle, both the boy and his mother would find themselves standing at the center of a storm, one that would test pride, prejudice, and the very definition of worth. The lobby doors opened with a rush of air, and a group of men in dark suits entered, their eyes scanning the room with sharp precision. They weren't ordinary employees. They were part of the company's internal security, summoned directly by the CEO. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor as they moved like a tide toward the corner, where Daniel sat with his laptop still glowing. Maria's heart stopped. She instinctively stepped in front of her son, her hands trembling but firm. "What's going on? Why are you coming at him like that?" she demanded. One of the men spoke in a clipped tone. "We need to speak with your son. Step aside." Maria's voice quivered with fear and defiance. "He hasn't done anything wrong. He's just sitting here." But Daniel, calm despite the sudden storm, closed his laptop and looked up at the men. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly. "They know." The lead officer extended his hand. "You're coming with us. The CEO wants to see you." For a moment, Maria wanted to shout, to protest, to tell them they had no right. But she saw the quiet confidence in Daniel's eyes, the way he carried himself with a strange mixture of humility and strength. She touched his arm gently, whispering, "Remember who you are." As Daniel was escorted upstairs, Maria followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew her son had done something extraordinary, but she also knew the cruel reality. In rooms filled with men like Richard Harrington, extraordinary didn't always mean respected. The elevator doors slid open on the 45th floor, revealing the tense air of the boardroom. Executives stood in clusters, whispering about the kid from the lobby. Their eyes narrowed as Daniel stepped inside, escorted by security, his mother trailing behind. Richard Harrington stood at the head of the room, his silver hair glinting under the lights, his gaze fixed sharply on the boy. The CEO's eyes swept over Daniel, his worn sneakers, his second-hand hoodie, and the laptop tucked under his arm. For a moment, Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, the unspoken judgment clear. This was not the face he expected to find behind a miracle. "So," Richard began, his voice heavy with authority, "you're the one who interfered with my system." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "I didn't interfere. I fixed it." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. No one had ever spoken to Richard Harrington in that tone, calm, unapologetic, and direct. Richard's brows furrowed. "Do you have any idea the kind of risk you took? Do you understand what would have happened if you'd made one wrong move?" Daniel's voice was steady. "Do you understand what would have happened if I hadn't?" The boardroom froze. Executives exchanged glances, torn between outrage and grudging acknowledgement. For the first time that day, Richard found himself momentarily speechless. Maria stepped forward, her hands clasped together nervously. "So, my son didn't mean any harm. He saw what was happening, and he couldn't look away. He's always been like this. When something's broken, he has to fix it. Please don't punish him for trying to help." Richard's eyes flicked to Maria, and in that instant, recognition hit him. He had seen her face before, not in boardrooms, not in meetings, but in the quiet corners of his empire. The maid who polished the floors, who moved unseen through the building. The idea that her son had walked into his kingdom and saved it unsettled him more than the system crash itself. An executive whispered harshly, "This is a security breach." He could have been a hacker, a thief. Daniel's jaw tightened. "But I wasn't. If I wanted to take your system down, I could have. Instead, I chose to bring it back. Doesn't that tell you something?" The room went silent again. It was a truth too sharp to ignore. Richard finally spoke, his tone measured. "What's your name?" "Daniel Johnson." "Johnson," Richard repeated slowly, his eyes shifting briefly to Maria. "Your mother works here." Daniel nodded. "Yes, and she works harder than anyone in this building. She deserves more respect than she gets." Maria's face flushed, torn between pride and fear. She wanted to hush her son, to protect him from saying too much. But Daniel stood tall, his words carrying a weight that reached every corner of the room. Richard's lips tightened again. He was a man who thrived on control, on hierarchy. In his world, worth was measured by position, by wealth, by pedigree. And here was a boy with none of those things daring to claim space in his empire. "You fix my system," Richard said at last, his voice laced with both grudging admiration and suspicion. "But why? Why would you risk yourself for a company that doesn't even know your name?" Daniel looked him straight in the eyes. "Because the system was broken. And when I see something broken, I fix it. Not for you, not for your company, but because it's what I do. It's who I am. The words struck the room like thunder. For some, they were inspiring. For others, infuriating. But for Richard, they were unsettling in a way he couldn't quite admit. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She had spent her whole life unseen, treated as background. Yet in this moment, her son had forced the most powerful man in the room to listen, not with anger, but with undeniable truth. An executive finally broke the silence. So, whether we like it or not, this young man just saved us from total collapse. The least we can do is acknowledge it. Richard raised his hand, silencing the room. He studied Daniel again, weighing him like an equation he couldn't solve. Part of him wanted to dismiss the boy, to erase his presence from this sacred space. But another part, small, reluctant, but undeniable, recognized the brilliance standing before him. You have talent, Richard said at last. But talent without discipline is dangerous. You should know that. Daniel gave a faint smile. And you should know that discipline without vision is useless. A stunned hush fell again. Maria gasped quietly, her hand flying to her mouth. She had always known her son was fearless, but to speak like this to the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the city was beyond anything she could have imagined. Richard's eyes narrowed, but instead of exploding in anger, he did something no one expected. He chuckled, low, sharp, almost bitter. You're bold. I'll give you that. Daniel stood his ground. I'm not bold. I'm honest. There's a difference. The tension in the room thickened, a clash of worlds colliding, the empire of privilege and the spirit of resilience. At its center stood a Maid son, holding his own against the man who had once thought himself unbreakable. What none of them knew was that this was only the beginning. Daniel's act of brilliance had opened a door that could never again be closed. And through that door would come not just recognition, but confrontation, of prejudice, of dignity, of justice. The CEO had lost all hope when the system crashed. Now, with hope restored by someone he had never valued, he was left with a question he had never asked before. What makes a person truly worthy? The boardroom buzzed again, voices clashing over what to do next. Some called for reward, others for punishment, and still others for caution. But in that storm of opinions, one truth remained steady. Daniel Johnson had just changed the story of Harrington Global forever. Maria stood quietly beside her son, her heart trembling with both pride and fear. She knew the world didn't easily forgive those who rose from the shadows. Yet she also knew that her son's light was too bright to be hidden any longer. And as Richard Harrington looked into Daniel's unwavering eyes, he realized that the boy who fixed his system might just be the one to break something far greater, the walls he had built around his own heart. The boardroom was a battlefield of whispers, suspicion, and uneasy admiration. Daniel stood at its center, his mother beside him, while the CEO studied him with the sharp eyes of a man who had built an empire by reading people. Richard Harrington was not used to being surprised, let alone by a 19-year-old boy who had walked out of the lobby and into his most private war. "Leave us," Richard finally said to the board. His voice carried no room for argument. Executives exchanged wary glances, but one by one, they filed out, their murmurs fading into the hall. Soon, only Richard, Daniel, Maria, and the security team remained. Maria clutched her hands tightly in front of her. She knew this was a moment when her son's brilliance might either be recognized or crushed. Daniel, however, stood relaxed, his laptop still tucked under his arm, as though this boardroom was no more intimidating than the corner where he had been sitting minutes earlier. Richard walked slowly toward the window, gazing out at the city sprawling below. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, without turning, he asked, "Do you have any idea how much power you held in your hands today?" Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "Enough to destroy you. Enough to save you. And I chose the second." Richard turned, his eyes narrowing. "Why?" Daniel shrugged. "Because I could. Because I don't like watching things fall apart when I know I can fix them." Richard studied him, as though searching for weakness. "You realize people like you don't just walk into rooms like this. You don't just appear in the story of a corporation like mine." Maria stiffened at the words. She had lived her whole life beneath those invisible ceilings, where people like her were never meant to rise beyond service. Daniel met Richard's gaze, unflinching. "Maybe that's a problem with your story. You've built it so high up you don't see who's holding it from below. The words landed heavier than anyone expected. Maria glanced nervously at Richard, but the CEO did not explode in anger. Instead, he lowered himself into his chair, staring at Daniel with a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. "You think you've proven something," Richard said slowly. "But a stunt like this doesn't make you a leader. It makes you reckless." Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't do this to prove anything to you. I don't need your approval. I did this because the system was collapsing and everyone in this building was panicking. You froze. Your people froze. And I didn't. That's a difference." The room went silent again. Maria's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She wanted to reach out and pull her son back, to tell him to stop before he said too much. But deep down, she knew this was who Daniel was, a voice the world had tried to silence, now refusing to fade. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. For the first time in years, he felt something rare: doubt. His whole life, he had believed in a hierarchy of worth, education, wealth, and pedigree. Yet here was a boy with none of those things standing in front of him, commanding the room with nothing but truth. Finally, Richard spoke. "What do you want, Daniel Johnson?" Daniel tilted his head, almost surprised by the question. "What do I want? I want a world where people like my mom don't get overlooked. Where people like me don't get told we're not good enough before we've even been tested. I don't want a seat at your table. I want the table to stop pretending only certain people belong there." Maria gasped softly, tears burning her eyes. She had scrubbed these floors for years, invisible to the very men who now listened to her son. To hear him speak their truth so plainly, it was both terrifying and liberating. Richard tapped his fingers on the table. "Idealism," he muttered. "The world doesn't bend that easily." Daniel's voice was quiet, but it cut like glass. "Maybe not, but sometimes it takes just one crack to bring the whole wall down. Today, that crack was me." Richard's jaw tightened. He wanted to dismiss the boy, to reassert control, to remind everyone of the weight of his authority. But the truth gnawed at him. The boy had saved his empire when no one else could. And not because he had been asked or paid or commanded, but because he had chosen to. At last, Richard exhaled heavily. "You're smart. I'll give you that. Smarter than some of the people I pay 6 figures to sit in this room. But talent needs direction. If you want to do more than stand in the lobby fixing things no one asked you to, you'll need opportunity. I can give you that." Maria's breath caught. She glanced at her son, expecting gratitude, maybe even relief. But Daniel's expression remained unchanged. "Opportunity," Daniel repeated slowly. "What kind?" "A position," Richard replied. "Training, resources, a chance to use that mind of yours where it belongs." Daniel's lips curled faintly. "And where do you think it belongs? Here? In your world of glass towers and boardrooms? Or out there, where people live with systems broken every day and no one fixes them because no one cares?" The question hung heavy. Richard's shoulders tensed. He had offered the boy a place in his empire, and yet the boy questioned the very value of it. Maria placed a trembling hand on her son's arm. "Danny, think about what you're saying." Daniel turned to her, his eyes soft. "I am thinking, Mom. I've thought about it every day. They'll give me a seat here only if I play by their rules. But what about the rules that never gave us a fair start? What about the rules that kept you scrubbing floors while people upstairs pretended you didn't exist?" Her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to shield him from the harshness of the world, but she also knew he was speaking the truth she had swallowed her whole life. Richard's voice broke the silence, low and deliberate. "You think dignity is given. It isn't. It's taken. And if you're smart enough to understand what you did today, then you're smart enough to know this is your chance to take it." Daniel's gaze locked with his. "No, dignity isn't taken either. It's lived. My mom has lived it every day in this building, unseen and unthanked, but with more honor than half the people who sit at this table. If I accept anything from you, it won't be because I need your stamp of approval. It will be because I choose to use your resources to build something bigger than you." The words struck the air like a challenge. Maria's breath hitched, fearing the fallout. But instead of anger, something unexpected flickered across Richard's face. respect, reluctant and raw. He rose slowly from his chair and extended a hand toward Daniel. The boy hesitated, glancing at his mother, then shook it. It wasn't a handshake of equals yet, but it was a beginning. "You've reminded me of something today," Richard said quietly. "That genius can come from anywhere. That the people we overlook may be the ones holding us up. I don't know what you'll do with what I offer, but I know this. You've earned a place in the story of this company. Whether you accept it or not is up to you." Daniel's grip was firm. "Then remember this, too. A story isn't worth telling if it doesn't change the people who hear it." For the first time in a long time, Richard Harrington smiled, not the polished smile of a CEO, but something real, tired, and human. As Daniel and Maria walked out of the boardroom, her hand slipped into his. She looked up at him with tearful pride. "You scared me in there," she whispered, "but you also made me the proudest I've ever been." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "You've carried me this far, Mom. Today was just me carrying a little of it back." Down in the lobby, the building hummed with life again. Systems online, phones buzzing, people moving with renewed purpose. Yet beneath the surface of that restored order lingered something new, the knowledge that salvation had come not from the top floors, but from the lobby, from a boy the system had overlooked and a mother who had never stopped believing in him. The CEO had lost hope when his empire collapsed. But hope returned not in the form of power, money, or pedigree. It came from dignity, resilience, and the brilliance of those unseen. And as the city skyline glowed in the evening light, one truth stood unshakable. When justice and pride rise from the shadows, no system, broken or unbreakable, can ever stay the same.